was closing the digs. So people who wanted to see it and feel it could come see it. The downfall was that like any other simulation, the purposeful nature of the simulation turns out to be everything. And capturing the purposeful nature of something like the humanities or something like social sciences and transpose that into a computer is extremely difficult, in that humans have something, a touch, something that computers cannot quite convey or capture or represent. So hopefully VR can do some of that, but you lose the interconnection, and you lose sort of the feel of the natural environment. So that was kind of the downfall, and I'm not sure how we can overcome that. But I now see the rise of facial computing, and I start getting worried a little bit that for gaming, for things like entertainment, this would be great, but for teaching and conveying purposeful meaning to things and objects in the past and history and others, and it would not quite replace that unique human connection that we share with one another. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saikou. I've seen a little bit of your, I've seen a little bit of that experience. I haven't gotten a chance to run through it the entire way myself, but every time I see it on video, I'm always excited about that. And I feel with you too about the human element. One of the things that we've been hearing and the feedback and talking to people about this project that we've been working on is the desire to create more communal spaces, to create a human element where the thinking is, I think we heard one great guy say, he put together a movie theater in VR. He thought everybody was going to be watching the movies, but as soon as they saw the person next to them was behaving naturalistically, they spent their whole time talking to each other rather than watching the movie in the movie theater. So that's an interesting problem. James, did you want to take a turn to share a little bit of your experience? I think we're going to need to unmute you, James.
Okay, we're there. Sorry, it wouldn't let me. I did just send an email. So great work, just amazing things happening at Old Dominion. So just congrats to the whole team. There's some amazing things that are about 2 years ahead of us. So we're just getting started with our XR lab. But I was going to share 2 resources that we use for all of our faculty. The chat's disabled, so I emailed them to you, Andrew. So if you could just give people those later. We developed the implementation plan that we had at Lindenwood was to ensure that VR is integrated into every degree and every program, and especially Gen Ed across the whole institution. So we started with art history because that's my field. And so we developed first off an application database so that no matter what, faculty don't need to know anything about VR whatsoever, but very practically, they can just look at the topic they're teaching that day and find the experiences that are available and then use them. Thank you so much. So we just put it in the chat there. And so we've just been expanding on that. And so we have all the other fields in there as well. And every new person I talk to, anyone in digital humanities and VR, they are so willing to share. It's just amazing. So we keep adding things that we get to these resources. And then there's also an how-to guide for introducing VR to faculty who are unfamiliar with it. And so why use it, how to use it in different fields, what to do in these different areas, as well as, plenty of references to get them started, resources, etc. And then it links them over to the application database. So that's what we did just to start with the buy not build strategy. So we went with the Quest 2, as you guys were talking about, because it was just once again more feasible to require our students to either purchase and or purchase ourselves to start our own XR lab. We then moved into developing simulations like what you're talking about. We started with Unity. We developed a template first-person shooter for, like cartoony works of art so that they could then practice memorization for comprehensive exams and things like that. We did another pardon me, here we go. Another museum a game that we're just working on just this last time. And then we're moving into what you're talking about, and that is we have a large game design program here as well. So leveraging the talents and the experiential learning opportunities of game design students and game design faculty in order to build these simulations. But we're now just getting started since we just founded the lab. We're getting everyone on board, showing them what can be done, holding, once again, workshops like this and show them, if you're in English, what do I do with it? And then we also started integrating GIS, right? VR into GIS with the SDKs that we can pull out into Unity and Unreal, which we have both here. So we work in Unity and Unreal. But there's a number of great projects that are underway. So I'm happy to share everything that we've got. And I love that you brought everything up on GitHub. So we'll throw things up there as soon as they're ready to go as well.
Awesome, James. Thank you so much. Oh, goodness. Oh, goodness. Muting my audio. Can you hear me?
I muted up.
Okay, I'm going to talk while you figure out what is happening in audio. I'm going to share, well, actually, I'll just share my link. That would work instead of having to share my whole screen. Hold on, got to copy it. So I just have some notes. I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different direction. I am not a game designer. My work is actually in disability studies and philosophy of technology. So I think a lot about what these technologies mean in our lives and how they square or don't square with our experiences. And I have some significant worries about how we engage with virtual reality in terms of what we think it does to us. So, I don't have a problem with what the trolley yard, which I love that name that you guys have on this Zoom call. I think it's an interesting ethical tool, but other people in the humanities are using virtual reality in ways to encourage empathy. And they think it's an empathy device, especially it's being adopted, sometimes humanities people are in on the work, but by engineering, by medicine, to enroll people in simulations to help them understand what it is like to be part of different minority groups. I think about this in terms of medical education where, questionnaires point to particular things with how they talk about, with how we see bias in medicine. I also see this upcoming, there are all of these simulations related to disability. And that's sort of my area that I can speak to. These simulations related to disability that are supposed to help people be better ethical actors by having more empathy for disabled people, by going through different experiences. There are suits that do this. So old age suits are increasingly used in gerontology to teach future gerontologists about what it's like to be older. And all of these are, of course, usually related to disability, right? That you can't move your joints in the same way that you used to. You might have some sort of goggles to simulate the fact that your eyesight has changed, maybe some sort of thing to muffle your hearing. You also see these for different categories of disability. These awareness exercises are not all virtual. So usually, and they've been done since the 70s or 80s, usually as disability awareness events, where people are supposed to experience the reality of someone who is not them, right? A lot of these things are done by wearing goggles, using different mobility equipment, wheelchair for a day type things. The sociological, so these all sound like great activities, right? Oh, we're going to learn about disabilities. Let's simulate disabilities. And then I'll have a greater awareness, and I'll go and I'll be a more ethical agent when I've realized that like what it is like to be someone else. What we find in the sociological data that this isn't the case at all, right? The surprise has been in terms of what this does to people who participate is it doesn't inspire the empathy that we hope it would. Some people learn things about the built infrastructure, but in fact, these disability simulations where you spend a day in someone else's shoes or a few hours actually increase feelings of fear about becoming disabled, increase the idea that disabled people are less competent, right? Because it was so hard for that participant. They can't imagine how it is that a disabled person navigates life like that every day. It ends up not doing the good work it was supposed to. So these different simulations, which are now being put on virtual platforms. So I see this being used in ethics education more and more often. And not just in ethics education. I think the last one I saw was a whole bunch of digital historians had recreated what it's like to be in the trenches of World War I, as if you can recreate the trenches of World War I and think that experience is authentic. We should view this as a piece of art, right? But to think that this is helping you understand the experience is probably incorrect, because you are not a person living during the time of World War I and experiencing the things people might think and feel during World War I, even if you added smell-o-vision, like Dr. Diallo would. I have a whole riff on. I want to ask you lots of questions about that later, but I'll hold it in for now because I'm super excited about smell-o-vision. So disability simulation is this practice that has these that leads to really negative perceptions about competence. And that's not what we expected. And people still do them all over. They also make non-disabled people think they know what it's like, such that they don't have to interact with people from this minority group any longer, right? If you already know what it's like to be disabled because you have worn blind goggles or you have used a wheelchair, then you might not think that you need to listen to people in this minority group any longer because you understand what the experience is. You don't really. But because you were supposed to go through this thing, people think that they have this sort of expertise about a group that they really don't, right? Most of us, being blind isn't just not seeing. Being blind is the social experience of not seeing as well, right? How people interact with you over long periods of time. It involves, other aspects of your identity as well. It also does this thing where it homogenizes the experience of disability. Most of us have more than one, or will acquire more as we age. Just using a wheelchair might actually tell you very little about someone's experiences in life, and pretty much no two wheelchair users are going to tell you the same story either. Your sort of focal experience here ends up being very different, right? What you pay attention to. If you are very good at using your wheelchair and you are used to it, and in fact, usually the wheelchairs people have individually are very different than the hospital wheelchairs they do these exercises with, which are much harder to move in. So it makes it seem even worse. I have these sorts of worries that come up, and we're seeing this, feed right into VR. People are not aware of these critiques. They think that these are good things to do that help other people. And we're increasingly seeing problems where it's not doing the work it should. And frankly, it's an offensive thing to do, right? To try on someone else's identity for a short period of time is not generally looked favorably upon. We can think about this in terms of other minority groups. So there's this book in sociology called Black Like Me by Howard John Griffith, who was a white man who took drugs to look darker and then traveled the US South and published in 1961 on what it was like to be Black in America, by sociological standards today, that is completely unethical, right? And these experiences also discount different people's positionality, that, you know, to be perceived as a white woman who is an amputee is very different than being perceived as a Black woman who's an amputee, right? This sort of embodiment matters to her interactions and the social world she sees, and pretending to be an amputee doesn't tell you much about either of our lives. I'll leave it there, but I have really grave concerns about virtual reality when we think it is helping us be better ethical actors.
Yeah, Ashley, thank you so much. So before I start yammering on and asking questions, because I get to have all three of you here in front of me to ask questions, I wanted to see if there were any questions from the rest of the group for any or all of these panelists, relying on their expertise and their unique positioning and views on these issues. I'm seeing Dan Knowlesball holding her hand up, and I'm realizing I am no longer the host. So Trolley Yard, can you please allow her to unmute so she can ask her question?
Hello.
All right, you're good.
Hey, Ashley, I just wanted to comment real quick. I'm here at ODU in the art department, and my research focuses on the artists actually who create multisensory VR environments. Specifically doing quantitative and qualitative analysis on how they look at accessibility and inclusion. So I'm really glad to have you here talking about specifically disability and diversity as a costume and how that transmediates to VR production. Many of the artists that I've worked with have mentioned accessibility and even trauma-informed design practices as primary leads, what they lead in with a lot of their concerns when they first start off in prototyping, even before prototyping, as far as ideation for the creation of environments. This is kind of specific, but considering the information we heard earlier, the demographics that Christoph was presenting, he mentioned that a lot of the actual headsets, you know, the materials of VR that are available to the public are primarily owned by white males, right? And I'm not quite sure if they collected any kind of data as far as the people's abilities, separate abilities, neurodivergence, et cetera, during the study. But what would you say about allowing a lot of these materials, these, you know, the basic headsets, the products to be accessible to more people? Because I think that's where it starts. I've noticed in a lot of VR testing that, you know, there's several different stages of getting participants into VR studies. And a lot of those can quickly eliminate people who are neurodivergent or people who have accessibility needs very early on in the process. What would you say about kind of adjusting those initial needs just for like research purposes alone for a lot of these environments that are being created for experiences and for immersion?
Yeah, I mean, I'm wondering if the trolley yard isn't going to take like a set of these headsets and like use them in philosophy classrooms, right? Although those also skew white and male. So maybe not philosophy classrooms, right? If that was our worry that we don't get a good sample size. I mean, I also noticed that it was skewed more towards people who are 18 to 24. So maybe not philosophy classrooms, but, you know, I can imagine, you know, taking these out, you know, into different communities to like, I think about like high school classrooms and things like that, where these could be used as tools for discussion for something like what Trolley Yard, oh God, I love the name, is proposing, you know, that gets you a different user set to analyze. And I wonder if there might be interesting differences in those groups. I wonder also about like whether the platform is accessible enough at its start where you can recruit like a wide sampling of different types of disabled people. So I have like a whole bunch of technical questions about like who can, like I've worn an Oculus. It's very heavy on my head. Like there's just like some physical concerns if this is the platform we're using. And Yeah, it's I think I love that your artists are thinking about trauma-informed design practices too. I think a lot of times when we go to VR, like flashing lights are normalized. I mean, I know a whole bunch of people with seizure disorders who can't possibly own a set like this because it will cause them harm. There's lots of things in that, like just thinking about how to make a platform like that accessible. And I like that the artists are thinking of it. I'm less worried about the artists actually than I am like what we think we're getting out of this though. Yeah, thank you.
If I might jump in real quick as trolley yard, and then we'll turn to our other panelists as well, just because we came up a couple times. We did on the demographics survey before the experience ask, do you use accessibility features in virtual reality? And if so, please list them, with the hope of getting more information about if there were things that we weren't offering that we could put in there to make them more accessible. But that is an area that we're trying to expand it into, and it's Trishaf's area of sort of interest and expertise is accessibility for these extended reality experiences. We're also exploring a partnership with the Norfolk Public Library. They've got it's called a U-Media program that's virtual reality headsets in libraries. And we're trying to get some younger people. We're aiming at high school students like 14 to 18 years old. And we're hoping to talk to that community first about their interest in virtual reality, and then see if we can make adjustments to what we're working on to better meet their needs in a sort of cooperative partnership with them. So that's one area that we're thinking about extending. Trisha, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yes. First of all, Ashley, I think extremely interesting point. I would just as a disclaimer say Saikou used to be my boss, but he was also a person that turned us into looking at VR, nothing different than TV set or a cassette player. And I had those conversations with Andrew that, I don't really care about VR. I mean, yes, you came to us because we can build it for you, but I cannot care less whether it's VR, XR, TV, piece of paper, because we have to look. This kind of unites us. You're interested about VR. I know how to kind of build some things in VR, but I struggle to sell from a different perspective in VR. So kind of what Ashley, you were saying, I have that trouble when I meet with people like Andrew. Can we think about something different that unites us, like accessibility, than VR? And it's very hard sell for me when I don't make it about what's my core expertise in terms of engineer. So I would like to hear your opinion, how somebody like me, we do try to do empathy in VR. We do try to, look at disability. There's a reason we didn't ask, are you disabled? We ask, are you using certain accommodations? Because it's also a definition of disability we're gonna assume is important, and we have to agree on some of those concepts. So my question is really, if not VR, how to unite this group around making our work better, to think how not to make those mistakes that you outlined. Because we probably make it all the time. We try to put people in other people's shoes, and if it's not the way, then what is it? What would be your advice to somebody like me, somebody like John?
Yeah, no, I mean, so I have a huge problem with thinking that we're actually creating empathy with a lot of these things. I think a lot of these exercises, at least in the disability literature and some of the literature about senior citizens, is that it doesn't actually promote empathy, right? And Rose Eveleth, in one of the articles I have linked in the Google Doc, actually does a good job of distinguishing between two types of empathy. And I think that hasn't been really discussed. Sometimes when we talk about understanding another person's perspective, it means listening to them, right? And hearing them out and hearing their experiences. A lot of the things that are done with awareness exercises and simulations are really about not listening to a person, but going through the same traumas they have been through, in order to help you recognize maybe bias or something like that. I think about bias in the built infrastructure, right? If you're trying out a wheelchair for the first time, like you're starting to notice that the built infrastructure kind of sucks when it comes to any sort of wheeled contraption. And what you're getting from participants there is, you're asking them to live through a trauma that doesn't belong to them. And then I think the whole experience is trauma, right? That being a wheelchair user or being blind, the blindness studies are particularly prejudicial, less so than the ones about mobility disabilities. When people finish pretending to be blind, they believe that blind people can't live by themselves. They believe that blind people couldn't possibly hold down jobs, and they feel sorry for blind people, which I don't know if you guys know many blind people, but blind people don't really want you to feel sorry for them. They don't think their whole life's a tragedy. Many of them have jobs and live on their own. Like, the data about blind people suggests that what people get out of blindness simulations is not correct, and is very different than listening to someone who is blind about their experiences, which, is much more likely, what you get in one of these simulations is what it's like to be disabled on the first day of a newly acquired disability. And on the first day of a newly acquired disability, it is traumatic and terrible, but that's not like, we have days after that. And that's why I feel like, a lot of these things that are trying to speak to, and, that try to take us on these first days are speaking to the trauma of being disabled, but it doesn't let people see out of the trauma and see how people adapt and have lives and have good lives and can flourish. Yeah.
So I want to give the other panelists an opportunity to jump in, but we're also getting a bunch of chat question follow-ups to Ashley. So I'll quickly ask James. I know he was putting some stuff in the chat to see if he had any thoughts, and then we can go to Saikou, and then we'll return to the chat questions for Ashley.
Sorry, was that you wanted to take a question, or did you want me to comment? So
I just wanted to see, if either James or Saikou have thoughts on this particular issue to weigh in.
I do have a lot of thoughts, but so to me, there's kind of two issues here. One is mainly technological, the form factor that the technology takes, and sort of what I was referring to earlier, which is kind of well-known in simulation studies all over, which is how do you convey the intent of the simulation to the audience? And in training, what Ashley's referred to is widely known since the 60s as negative training, meaning you can build a simulation for one purpose and the users of that simulation can take out or learn something completely different from what you intended. And it's been widely documented in pilot training and other studies in medical training. You can learn the wrong thing from simulation. But I think the bigger issue, going back to my earlier point, is not that whether VR is suited or not to teach empathy or other disabilities. And actually, I also work in that area, so it's pretty cool. It is more, what is empathy, and how do we all experience empathy? So in this example of blind people, I would argue there is no such thing as a blind people, or people are autistic. This is James, John, Mike. They have completely different experiences of what they're living and what they're going through. So I don't think the intent of the simulation is to convey that necessarily, whether it does it well or poorly. The intent is the question is, to what extent can you walk in anybody's shoes? To what extent can you generalize these things? But to me, that's of less concern than the use of the technology, what is now being called face computing in general, outside of this retrospective, outside of the intentionality. The intentionality you can work on, you can fix, you can critique it. There's a lot of work you can do, but the daily use of face computing, we have no idea what that's going to look like. We have no idea what it's going to make people do. We have no idea whether it be used for good or bad, whether it's inclusive or not. we have zero idea yet. It is being built, it is being fielded, it is being sold. People are buying it, people are using it. So to me, that's, if I had a concern, that would be the wider concern that I have, and I totally resonates with me, that we cannot convey this very complex emotion, or any complex emotion, in fact, through any of these form factors, and they're not well suited for it. But again, I would argue that that's sort of well known, at least in our community. Let me put it that way. That is known. Right?
Thank you so much, Saikou. James, did you have a follow-up? And then we've got a question from the chat we're going to go to.
Oh, no, just briefly, I was just very interested in all of that, since we have a lot of studies that are aligned similarly. I should have specified, we're just looking at the effective use of VR technology as opposed to watching videos or reading. And so completely agree. It was a wonderful, controversial use of body swap, you know, where you have these individuals who are Caucasian, who are supposedly, they did scans once again to see after 4 minutes and how they could disassociate from their own identity and or become more open, you know, about others. But it was, of course, as Ashley brought up, entirely, you know, biased, because it's not the experience that you have of someone just by looking at them, but instead on, you know, actually living an entire life and being in these, you know, systemic kind of circumstances. But I'm more interested in the use of VR. But obviously, you talked about, you know, you wanted something social and you wanted to bring, you know, people together. I mean, you know, Meta just launched their first one based on Roblox. I think it was just like today. And you can go to Altspace VR. You can bring all these others. But if we can democratize the technology, it can also be used in order to empower these disadvantaged groups as well, who may not have the resources in their schools or not be able to, you know, have engineering equipment and or, you know, specialized, you know, chemistry labs, or wouldn't be able to travel to see certain things, to experience different cultures. So there's I can see the pros and cons and the dangers, but also there's a great deal that can be gained by this technology as well if used correctly. But that's going to take policy and ethical consideration.
Thank you so much, James. So the next person up on the queue is going to be Giovanni. Giovanni, I've given you unmute permissions if you want to ask your question, and then we'll go to Kent Bai and then David Schwann. Giovanni, I think you're still muted. Oops. Okay, we'll try moving on to Kent Bai and we'll swing back to Giovanni. Kent, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, I just thanks for this discussion. Well, lots of provocative thoughts, and I appreciate the skepticism that you're bringing, Ashley, to virtual reality. I guess from my perspective, I've seen thousands of different experiences, and including narrative experiences like Traveling While Black or Book a Distance, which I would say is probably some of the better empathy pieces. And so I'm curious if you've seen some of those pieces of empathy VR and what your thoughts on specifically, like say Traveling While Black or Book a Distance, as to why those might be bad in terms of trying to explore different issues of empathy.
Yeah, I haven't used either of those resources. I've been mainly watching all the new fancy suits to pretend you're old in, which are not necessarily VR, but are you know, they have different sensors and resistors and things as part of that. So I'm afraid I can't speak to either of those materials.
Okay, well, I would just sort of push back on some of your skepticism on empathy by sort of pointing to some of these different narrative experiences that have been produced. I do think there's a lot of work that's out there. So I guess I'm a little confused as to like the blanket, like all empathy is bad explorations, because I do think, I mean, there are certain, like Clouds Over Siege is a good example where there's sort of a colonial Western gaze that happens within a piece like that, where the people that are being featured are not in control of authoring their own stories. And you kind of have the sort of Western colonial mindset coming in there and covering that and speaking on behalf of these other people, telling their stories. To what degree do they have the ability to edit? And those are the pieces that are sort of exalted as the pinnacle of the empathy experiences. But of course, they have all these issues that are problematic. But I'd say issues like traveling all black, produced by people of color, being able to tell their own stories and use the virtual reality medium is extremely powerful pieces that I think do an amazing job of cultivating empathy. So I don't I necessarily agree with the kind of the blanket dismissal of all empathy pieces within XR.
Oh, I guess I'm thinking about how empathy gets operationalized in classrooms around these materials. Certainly when we think about different types of narrative devices that can help people understand other people's experiences. I'm not going to, like, I don't want to poop. I'm skeptical about empathy in the classroom, but I also think about the great power of different types of literature and artistic movements. And if we take VR as something special and different, especially as how it gets operationalized in education, then I have some real worries. I think if we're talking about narrative experiences that are led by people who own those narratives, I'm a lot less skeptical on those sorts of things.
Okay, that makes sense. Thanks.
I guess I might jump in here as a pseudo panelist as well, that, having gone through many of these experiences, the concerns that I have involve hyperbole, right? When they use language like "you will now have the embodied experience of someone else," that's the kind of stuff that I get tripped up on, because I take embodied experience to be a very particular term that requires not just vision, not just smell, not just tactile, but a whole life history. And so when that's what the claim is, that's when I get nervous. But I guess I don't have difficulties with using this as another tool for trying to understand, each other's lived experience. It's when you think that we've created a perfect, stand-in for that then we start to get worried. And part of this, I think, is that the technology is comparatively young, so you make grandiose claims to get, the money to do the research, to do the projects. But sometimes I wonder, like, are we taking enough time to step back and really reflect on how much of what we think we're doing is actually reflected in the language we're using to talk about what we think we're doing?
Can I? So there's some wonderful work out of Australia on this topic at the University of New South Wales. Looking at robots, looking at how Native people tell their story, looking at different types of, not just empathy, but people with mental illnesses. I worked with a fabulous researcher out there who's done some work on end of life, and also on people with different physical, on the physical spectrum, different ways that people exist, and see that. I think the main issue, the main lesson that at least we've learned throughout this process is who gets to tell the story, right? Who tells the story and whose story is being told makes all the difference. If the engineer or the person who's not part of the story, who hasn't lived the story, is telling us, they tell a different story from the person who owns it and tells it. That person might not be technical, that person might not be capable of implementing that into a solution. And that's why it's important to have teams that are balanced, that are representative of the people whose story are being told. And those people get to validate and say, yes, this story represents our lived experience. And that, I think, is as far as we can go. But there's danger in absolutely having anyone try to use the technology to convey things that they don't really understand intimately, or that they don't live on a daily basis. So that's why in our work, we try very hard to sort of stay within our lanes and say, hey, we're engineers. We don't really know what it feels. And we'll try to be kind of like this blank canvas where we allow people to paint and tell their story. And we do as much as possible, try to just replicate or represent that and not take a stance on whether the story is told the right way or the wrong way.
Thank you, Saikou. So we've got a question in the chat now from Giovanni. It sounds like they're having a little bit of difficulty with unmuting, but it says, for Ashley, to continue on your perspective of empathy through VR, could you further compare and contrast attempted firsthand experiences in VR to secondhand experiences in non-VR narrative-centric media, and add what you see as future implications based on the limitations or needed additions to the VR empathy projects?
Not sure I understand the question. Which is difficult if
I was gonna say, given that we can't ask Giovanni
I'm so sorry.
clarify.
I mean, I like non-VR narrative centric media. I mean, on the link I gave you, I mean, I end with a poem that I really like, that bears witness to the experience of Lynn Manning. So I'm gonna talk about the poem for a second. The poem by Lynn Manning, who is a blind Black man, is about how he transforms for other people. And the magic wand, which is the title of the poem, is his cane that indicates that he is blind, right? And he's the one holding the wand, but everyone else is doing the magic. Because when he whips out the cane, he goes from being a tall Black man who might be good at basketball, and some other stereotypes about tall Black men, to being someone who's a crip and probably on government assistance, right? You know, being someone who's visibly disabled in public, right? So it's this whole transformation. He waves the wand, but in fact, it's everyone else doing all of this work from their biases and preconceptions about him, right? That we're using this technology, right? And the technology in this case is just his wand as he pulls it out, and that he's doing this sort of transformational work in our imaginations. I think about the ways in which different tools shift how we think about different things, and not always in good ways, right? We just employ new sets of biases in different tools, given use of different types of tools. I think what Lynn Manning's not telling us much about himself other than the fact that he's Black or blind in this poem. The poem is about other people's perceptions. And I think so often when we go into some of these experiences that are supposed to promote empathy, we still rely back on biases and tropes. I think about all the sort of media tropes that play into a lot of perceptions. But we tend to fall back on those things. And I do wonder about how to get better media in some of these spaces. And it sounds like Kent has some idea of some better media in these spaces. So I don't think it's impossible. And I like VR. And I really, I want to smell all the things that you can let me smell, Diallo. I'm very much excited about that. But yeah, I think about how we're still using our biases, and it's really harder to break out of those a lot of times.
If there is some piece of VR media out there, Kent has heard of it or experienced it himself. So
I'm excited for his talk.
David, I believe that you had a comment and or question in the chat, so I wanted to give you an opportunity to follow up if you're still here and still wanting to talk.
It might be redundant at this point. So I'm wondering maybe if part of what could clarify some of this, sorry, I misspelled your name in the chat, Ashley. If what could clarify a little bit of this is whether or not it's particularly objectionable to be taking, because VR kind of forces you in some cases into a first person perspective. It forces you into the shoes of a particular individual, and you might then quickly infer, I understand what it's like to have this particular set of experiences. But you can imagine lots of VR experiences that don't drop you directly into the shoes of a particular individual who's having experiences or moving through the world. And so maybe I'm wondering if part of the objection to VR with the idea that it's not really giving us this deep empathetic experience is that first personal nature of things, and whether or not we could have a social context that's more fleshed out, and it's kind of narrative interactions that you might have with individuals second personally, that you think might be better at cultivating what it is that people are trying to get at with the empathy and sympathy, which is a little bit of a better understanding of what it's like to be, another individual. And if you think literature and film can kind of do this, then why not think that these super immersive experiences, could do it even better? So I guess that's a long version of my question or my comment.
Yeah, I mean, in a perfect world, we would interact with a variety of people. Right, and listen to what they have to say about their experiences in a firsthand sort of way. A lot of times we think about some of these materials as stand-in for that perspective. But what I would rather have people do instead of disability simulations is like know disabled people in their communities and listen to them about their experiences, because often disabled testimony about disabled life is dismissed, right? Disabled people get cast as moochers and fakers, that we're not authentic about the disability status we have, that we're not trying hard enough, that we are bitter cripples. Those are narratives that go along with being disabled. And it means that in most settings, people don't listen to disabled people about disabled life. Right. So what I would rather have people do instead of disability awareness events, instead of thinking that they're getting empathy through any of these media, are actually like normalizing disabled people and disabled expertise in their own lives. I feel that way similarly about other categories of marginalization, where it would be better, in fact, to interact with people and believe them about their life's experiences, because we see with a lot of minority groups that people simply don't believe us, or not just minority groups, but marginalized groups. I think about how when women report pain in medical settings, how we aren't believed. And it's much worse, of course, for Black women. Like, and this is part of all of our cultures. With terrible results, right? That we didn't get more empathy because we didn't believe women, we didn't believe Black people, we didn't believe disabled people, and people that share multiple types of marginalization in there too. So really about having a diverse community and actually believing people would be the better route than a lot of these virtual reality and simulation type events. And for the question about first person narrative, I think first person narrative can be really powerful, but I also think there are a lot of pitfalls. The Rose Eveleth article that's linked in my Google Doc points to one study that people report feeling less empathy and connection to their character, white people do, when they're given Black characters to play. Right, there are demographic realities to what bodies we put people in, even in virtual reality, where people come to them with their prejudices already in place. And a lot of these are implicit, right? But their rating of how much they relate to the character, how much they believe the character that they're playing in first person games is actually related to the race of that character. Rose Eveleth cites it in her particular piece called The Limits of Empathy.
James, did you have a follow-up that you wanted to say here?
No, I just wanted to say, yeah, that's it, absolutely. And we have 3 different diversity initiatives going on at our institution at the moment. And the first thing everyone always asks, and as we were talking about there, is, well, just hire, someone of a different persuasion, ethnicity, or et cetera, as your president or provost. And so you put out, you put out the searches, you look for, you're like, wait a minute, no one's applying, that meet those specific criteria. And you're like, why not? And the same way you have here is you noted that most of those that own VR headsets are white males. Why is that? Why don't we see more people from either female or minority backgrounds going into computer science or engineering or in these areas? So if you want the diverse perspective, we have to go way back to the source, right? And in order to, begin dealing with it, at the outset, instead of, kind of doing a retroactive back end, kind of fix.
Yeah, I think empathy, again, going back to that, probably that work out of Australia, empathy in particular is very tricky. And in its current form, in the way that it's defined, it's also biased towards people of a certain, who are in a certain position from a neurodiversity standpoint. So if you're on the autism spectrum, the idea that you can walk in somebody's shoes is completely foreign, right? So the way that we look at, again, that's why I say it's very difficult for VR to convey these things, because empathy in that sense, then if we're looking at across the board from a neurodiverse standpoint, it's the ability to hear and understand somebody else's experience. It's not to live that experience. You cannot live that. You cannot walk, really understand what it was. It's just listen and acknowledging that other people live a different experience or go through life differently is really I think the proper way. And there's a lot of studies that have shown how people interact with robots and people that work with machines to demonstrate that humans tend to project their own emotions and feelings onto objects that are not there at all. So I think empathy in particular here, that's great discussion. I think it's a very specific case. But the technology in general, right, I think we're focusing here on digital technology, but there are other kinds of technology, analog technology, for instance, the wheelchair is technology, right? Augmentative hearing is technology. There's a lot of other technology that don't have this form of controversy. So the question is, what makes virtual reality, what makes digital, computable forms of expression questionable or difficult for us to grapple with? And I think it's because simply they are widespread and everybody can use them for all kinds of different things and are designed specifically to address equality or inequality issues. We want to bend them to that use, but I want to go back to the people who design and build, because that's my perspective. The design and build don't have this intentionality associated with these objects. They actually are playing sort of God, right? They're playing, we engineers, we make things, we put them out there, and we let you, the humanist, figure out what it means. We kind of are happy to make it and then put it out there. And that's the danger that I see. That's where I and Christoph can attest to that. That's my biggest issue. If the engineers who are building these devices, these objects, are not aware of the devastating potential of the objects, they're not taking into account the uses of the objects, and then we'll always have these problems of retrofitting things. I go back to face computing. It's not glasses that take pictures in the moment you're enjoying something. Right? What is that going to do to you now? What is that going to do? Like, I think you guys, the humanities and social scientists, are kind of catching up to the technology, but people are not asking these questions anymore. It's good that us in this academic setting are worried about all these things, but the gaming industry, I can name all kinds of industry, don't care about any of this stuff. They're not going to. So it's too late. I hate to be kind of defeatist. It's too late at this point. This is an interesting discussion, but until you hold us accountable, you make us pay for putting stuff out there that we don't understand just because it's cool and we can do it. We will always be having these discussions. And as soon as we put it out there, somebody's going to try to make it an object to communicate quote unquote empathy. Somebody's going to try to use it to make it do something that it's not designed to do. It's just a form factor, the engineers would say, but this discussion proves that it's not, right? And that's really, to me, the big issue, and that's where we'll always end up. We are hungry for technology. We as a society, and here I'm originally from West Africa, so I always laugh a little bit when we talk about pervasive or 1824, because we're always talking about from this country or from this perspective, from the Western side of things. A lot of people in the world don't have access to VR headsets. I don't see anybody torn up by that, right? Yeah. It's like the same thing I saw with climate change. As desertification has been going on for over 100 years. Nobody was really too worried about it until the condos started getting flooded in most of the rich countries. Now it's a big problem. We need to do something about climate. The same thing. I mean, until technology is not taken into account worldwide, like we don't have a global perspective on this, and we don't hold engineers accountable for the stuff that they build, we'll end up here, sadly.
Well, I'm hoping that I'm going to be, a little optimistic with James, is that sort of early intervention, rather than waiting and doing what I call retrospective ethics, where we say, oh, shoot, we made something and now all this bad shit's happening. How did we get here? Starting these conversations early and often, early in the career, early in the development of the technology. We can not have to hold engineers accountable, but we've been having the conversations the entire time. Because I think it's also important that as a humanities person, I understand a little bit more about how the technology works. Some of these issues might be addressable in part by changes in the underlying technology. And so I think I think it's also, if I want to engage in these spaces, it's also on me to go out and ask the questions about how the technology works. That's why John has to deal with teaching me how to use Unity and GitHub, because I want to know some about what's going under the hood if I'm going to be talking and asking questions about it. This has, though, brought us to full time for this session. So we're going to take a short little break here, about 15 minutes. We're going to come back at 2:30 for Kent Bai's keynote closing presentation. So let's thank our panelists once again, and thank you so much for great questions and great conversation, everybody. See you all at 2:30.
Dr. Diallo? Oh, can I ask you a question?
I was actually saying nice to meet you. Yes, absolutely.
Philosopher, but every time I chat with him, he's spinning circles around my head in terms of his philosophical knowledge. So I'm very excited about his talk today. Kent has, at this point, thousands of interviews with people working in VR, Kent?
I've recorded around 1,600 or so and published over 1,000.
Yeah, geez. So if there's a corner of the VR world, Kent has overturned those, and that's included conversations with folks across sort of every humanities circle and every technological circle. So I'm really excited to hear what he has to talk about today. His talk is entitled Process Philosophy in VR, the Foundations of Experiential Design. So Kent, please take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for the invitation to come speak to some other philosophers here. I self-identify as an aspiring philosopher since I don't have formal training in philosophy, but it's something that I've taken great interest in, and I have my own way of kind of digging into different corners of, I guess, emerging paradigms and other, I guess, the types of philosophies that I'd say are not necessarily the mainstream yet. And so I take a very pluralistic approach of trying to synthesize all these different frameworks together to kind of, for my own sense, for my direct embodied experience, to create some sort of conceptual frameworks to help understand my embodied experiences within XR. So today I'm going to be talking about the process philosophy and VR, the foundations of experiential design. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about these different things today. So what is experience and some of the deeper philosophical context for process, experiential design framework that I have that I'll go into quality, story, context, and character. And then for each of those, I'll do a little bit of a sidebar for some of the philosophical concepts for each of these. And then a little bit of a process philosophy primer, a deep dive at that point. And then looking at both the perception as process and design as process. All right, so let's first look at what is experience. So there was a piece in the Harvard Business Review back in like 1999. It was called Welcome to the Experience Economy by Pine and Gilmore. And they talk about this kind of progression of economic value that goes from like commodities to goods to services to staging experiences. And so we're kind of moving beyond goods and services into experiences. And so a lot of the, companies like Starbucks are actually, producing experiences for the customer. And so it's got this whole list of different aspects of the, from, the services and experiences. And if you look at the definition of experience, there's different things that it's memorable, it's personal, it's revealed over a duration of time. It's someone who's a guest, and you have different embodied sensations. So, if I look up the definition of experience, it's a process of doing and seeing things and having things happen to you, which I think is, actually quite profound in the sense that it's a process. So the experience itself is a process. Oops. So experience is a process that unfolds over time. And when you think about something unfolding in time, you can think about it in terms of a story and how some stories have like a 3-act structure. But of course, not all experiences are nicely bound into this type of, narrative that's that drama. But there might be a beginning, middle, and end generally to something that's unfolding over a period of time. You have here the Joseph Campbellian hero's journey, where you're going out and you're having some sort of ordeal and you're coming back. But there's some evolution and growth that happens over that course of time. But it's also an experience as a process that unfolds over time. And even when you look at the philosophy of time, what is time? So if we're talking about experience, we have to also start to consider what time is. And so Aristotle, when he's talking about time, I like his definition, which is a number of change with respect to the before and the after. So this is from Physics 219b, or Physics 4, Book 4. So I have this video here, and I think this is actually a, oops, there we go. So the moon libration. So the moon kind of wobbles back and forth, but it's going through a cycle of the Earth relative to the moon, but also relative to the sun. So as the moon goes around the Earth, you're getting the sense of a lunation cycle here, which is around 27, a little over 27 days. But also, if you think about the course of a day, the day is a diurnal rotation of the Earth where the sun is going around. And so you get the sense of a day, you get the sense of a month here for the moon, and you get the sense of a year by the time it takes the Earth to take a full solar rotation around the sun. So as you look at time, you can look at things relative to each other. So two objects relative to each other and how they move relative to each other gives you these different periods of time. There's also longer periods of time if you start to look at, say, this cycle between Venus and the Earth. So this is Earth in the center here, and it's the geocentric orbital rotation. So the sun is here, and then the Venus is going around the sun. And as it goes around, you can see that this is 8 Earth solar orbits and then 13 solar Venus orbits. And there's 5 points when they conjunct here. But this pattern here is a representation that actually unfolds over 8 years. So you could say this spatial representation between the relationship between the Earth and the Venus is around 8 years. But each of the planets actually have their own little cycles relative to each other, and it goes all the way up to, like, Neptune and Pluto is about 494 years. And you have different periods of time through each of these different planets. So this is kind of like a shape of being able to create both a spatial representation of time, but also a relational representation of time of two bodies relative to each other. Okay, so that's a lot about the Chronos time, but the Greeks also had 2 words for time. There's the Chronos time, which is sort of the unfolding of the time that could be measured. And then there's the Kairos time, which was the quality of the moment of the time. And this is where I think we get into some of the more interesting philosophical aspects of, like, what is the Kairos? What is the quality of the moment of the time? So as we look at the Kairos, it's the kind of the right time to act, but it's also implying that there might be other dimensions beyond space and time that start to get into these concepts of potential. And potential is going to be a huge concept when it comes to process philosophy, and we'll be digging into that a little bit more. But the Greeks would talk about it as kind of a sense of doing the right thing at the right time. So that's the Kairos time. So when we talk about process philosophy, this is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy definition. They start off saying that process philosophy is based on the premise that being is dynamic, and that the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality and our place within it. Even though we experience our world and ourselves as continuously changing, Western metaphysics has long been obsessed with describing reality as an assembly of static individuals whose dynamic features are either taken to be mere appearances or ontologically secondary or derivative. So there's a lot of focus within analytic tradition that turns things into objects, and then your, like, say, consciousness is a property of the physical aspect of your neurology firing, as an example, the kind of eliminative materialistic perspective of consciousness. But I think a lot of the process relational approaches put the process as being fundamental, so that you could actually have consciousness as more of a fundamental field. Panpsychism is something that is often linked to also Alfred North Whitehead and also William James and a number of different theorists. And I think in the analytic tradition, Philip Goff's recent book covering panpsychism is turned out to be, because there's the hard problem of consciousness, that there's like, how do you get consciousness out of material reality? And the answer could be that every little bit of reality has a bit of consciousness, or you could start to say that there's something that's more deeper than material reality, that there's actually these aspects of qualia or consciousness, or David Ray Griffith has actually called what Whitehead's perspective is more pan-experientialism, meaning that he sees that all of reality is experience. So that's a process philosophy where you see this difference between substance metaphysics and process relational metaphysics, where there's kind of like an order where physics, chemistry, biology, and psychology, but at the basis are kind of this kind of assumption of material reality. I say assumption because it's a metaphysical assumption, and there's no proof one way or another as to what is the ground of the metaphysical reality. For process relational metaphysics, they're claiming that the ultimate basis of reality is both process and relationship and potential, and that you could describe all of reality by, or essentially what Whitehead set this concept of mereology, which is whole part relationships. So it's a whole part series of event relationships, of event sequences that are kind of in relationship to each other, and they're kind of being adopted by each other in this kind of fractally nested unfolding. And it's through this philosophy of organism that Whitehead comes up with. Now it's kind of a big paradigm shift, and I'll have a number of other ways of digging into that, especially through aspects of quantum ontology to kind of unpack that a little bit more. But the basis is that if you want to have the fundamental building blocks of all of nature of reality, process relational and process philosophers say that you could just use processes and relationships, that you could look at the quantum relationships as kind of an ecological relationship of a lot of entities that are patterned relationships of energy relative to each other. And that's all you need to be able to describe all of reality. So a number of different process relational theorists is Heraclitus, and other branches of philosophy from like Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, indigenous philosophy, Buddhism, and Taoism. All of them have very much process relational orientations, but also like Bruno, Spinoza, Leibniz, Schelling, Bergson, Peirce, James, Dewey. Alfred North Whitehead is a big focus in terms of the 20th century philosophers that were really pushing forth the process relational sort of paradigm shift. He was a metaphysician, he was a mathematician, but also put forth this pretty radical metaphysical framework that has had huge impact on ecological movements and systems theory and whole philosophy of biology and quantum ontology and a whole number of different approaches. But one of his students is Charles Hartshorne, and then Sellers, Bateson, Deleuze, Rescher, Latour, Stengers, Hegel, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Jung, Teilhard, Chardin, and Bohm. So if you're familiar with any of these, then these are kind of in the realm of process relational theorists, and these are all happen to be the type of thinkers that I tend to get drawn to. So Whitehead's process philosophy, he says that there's these actual entities, or that you can describe the nature of the universe as determined by its eternal relations to other actual entities. And his metaphysical framework, I'm not going to dig into all the specific nuances of it, but suffice to say is that the relationality is a big part of process relational metaphysics. So another big thing that I just want to bring up at this point is that the map is not the territory. I'm a huge fan of different frameworks, and there's a tendency to try to say that these frameworks are kind of a one-to-one mapping of reality. And I think, there was a Korbinski who said that obviously that the map is not the territory, but there was also a pretty famous thing that Whitehead said, which was that, the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, which is that you start to create these different frameworks, and then you project onto that is reality. And I think that Whitehead would actually say that the substance metaphysics is actually a fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And Bergson also talked about it like the distortion of nature due to the intellectual spatialization of things. So it's the process when you kind of spatialize, when you spatialize the expression of more concrete facts under the guise of very abstract logical constructions. And so he sees this as kind of a logical error of kind of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. And so he calls it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And the author of the entry of the SCP for the process philosophy was actually Johanna Seit, and she's got this piece called The Myth of the Substance and the Fallacy of Misplaced Concreteness, where she goes through in great detail, kind of arguing all the different ways in which that substance she concludes that the category of substance doesn't actually provide us with a uniquely powerful explans for the notion of logical and physical unity. So there's more if you want to dig into I'm not going to dig into the nuances of that debate, but suffice to say that there's many different process relational approaches to quantum mechanics, a lot of different quantum ontologies. Carlo Rovelli's relational quantum mechanics, even though he's not specifically a Whiteheadian using his metaphysics, but there's just a lot of approaches where you can start to explain quantum mechanics by relationality. The Foundations of Relational Realism is one that I also call out by Epperson and Zefiris. They've been a part of the number of discussions that I'll dig into a little bit later. And there's some others as well, but that's just kind of a reference to kind of other pointers. But there's also, Seit has a number of different alternative ontologies that beyond substance metaphysics. So there's state affairs ontologies, trope ontologies, attribute ontologies, and process ontologies. I'll be posting all of my notes here. So if you want to check out some of these citations and dig into some of this more, then after my talk, I'll be posting these slides. You can dig in more, but I'll be focusing specifically on the process ontologies. All right, so again, we have the substance metaphysics and the process relational metaphysics, where I point out that the basis of the substance metaphysics is physics, and there's a shift where Whitehead is putting biology as the basis. And so he's using biological metaphors, so that you could use biological metaphors to be able to describe the lowest quantum realities to human nature, to the largest degrees of what's happening in the cosmos. All right, so this is a metaphor that I'd like to look at, which is a concentric wave singularity. This is basically a concentric circle where they're having pulsing at a certain frequency, and you're seeing that eventually these waves collide to create this 90-foot spike of water. And I like this as a metaphor for kind of imagining that there's these waves of potential that are beyond space and time, these non-local fields, and that they're somehow combining. And then as they combine, then they sort of break through, and you can think of it as kind of a metaphoric collapse of the wave function. And when that wave function collapses, then there's the translation of potential into actuality. And then I think the process relational approaches is a huge focus of saying that the potentials are actually real. Something like the Everett mini worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is trying to take all of the potentials and actualize them into a spatialized parallel universe that you can't observe. So there's kind of a resistance to trying to accommodate different aspects of potential. And Whitehead, just as a background, he was a mathematical physicist, and so he was teaching. As a mathematician, he was very up to speed with what was happening with general relativity. Arguably, one of the first people to really comprehend what Einstein was saying, given his background in mathematics and mathematical physics, but also was in dialogue with what was happening with the quantum ontologies. And so he ended up taking a professorship at Harvard, where he did a lot of different teaching, where he was kind of synthesizing his ideas of being kind of dissatisfied after the Principia Mathematica, which was the point where he was trying to translate all of mathematics into logic with Bertrand Russell. That failed. After Gödel came back with the incompleteness theorem and other sort of liar paradox aspects with that Whitehead was really trying. Both Whitehead and Russell were trying to set on the foundation of all mathematics on logic. That failed, and Bertrand Russell went on to kind of so the story goes, kind of found the tradition of, in some ways, the analytic philosophy with the kind of the goal with the basis of logic. And then Whitehead was kind of liberated to be able to go off and be a little bit more experimental and using his mathematical brain to start to define other metaphysical frameworks that were going to be more encompassing for what he thought was going to be more aspects of the nature of reality, meaning that there was a lot more to math than just logic, i.e. that there was a lot of aspects of intuition and feeling. And, this process of discovering mathematical intuitions was that there was something beyond just logic. All right, so that's just a little bit more context. So what is reality? So there is the whole David Chalmers' virtual realism that he presented as a series of lectures in 2016. This is the virtual and the real, and he had a number of different questions. And so he was asking, are virtual objects real or fictional? Do virtual events really happen or not? Are virtual experiences non-illusionary or illusionary? And are experiences in VR as valuable or not as valuable as experiences outside of it? So I think these series of questions actually sort of address different metaphysical assumptions that you have, because if you have sort of the physicalist materialistic orientation and you say that all of reality is based upon material, concrete stuff, and that even virtual reality is kind of created as a dialectic between the virtual and the real, that creates, in my mind, a false bifurcation between our experiences, which could actually go beyond the physical realities. Whether it's whether it's consciousness is fundamental, or just in general, you don't have to make a metaphysical assumption. It's just the fact that you're saying that something is real or not real. So with the physicalism, then you have the tendency to say, well, these virtual objects are obviously fictional, that these events are not really happening, that the virtual experiences are illusionary, and that experiences in VR are not as valuable as ones outside of it. So this is kind of like the metaphysical foundation, that the conclusions that I think you are easy to come to. But if you say that, say, consciousness is fundamental, or if there's something deeper, say a more process relational approach, then you're looking at it in terms of the human experience, independent of what type of mediation you're having your experience from. So then, virtual objects are real. The virtual objects the virtual events do really happen. The virtual experiences are non-illusionary, and the experiences in VR are just as valuable as experiences outside of it. So I think, these questions also, like, I was sort of dissatisfied from the existing, traditional metaphysical approaches of substance metaphysics, because I don't think actually it's very robust. And, you could also argue that you don't need to make a metaphysical shift, but I find when talking about experiential design, that it's easier to talk about it in terms of that the consciousness and experience is fundamental. And when you start from there, then you start to build everything else around that. All right, so again, the Western metaphysics has long been obsessed by describing reality as a series of these static objects, and that there's all the features are the qualitative and the qualia and all these other features are ontologically secondary or derivative. Okay, so that's that. So now I'm going to dig into a little bit of the experiential design framework. So this was, I guess, built and cultivated over the last like 7 years or so. As I've been going through experiences, I try to find, in some ways, different sense-making frameworks for me to find the language to describe the different trade-offs and the different aspects of the experiences. And so it's a quality, story, context, and character. And then I'll be giving a little bit of some brief philosophical sidebars at the end of each of these sections, different issues that come up. And then I'll be diving into the process philosophy primer and then looking at perception and design. Okay. So there's this quote from Margaret McKee that says, true character is revealed in the choices the human being makes under pressure. And then the greater the pressure, the deeper the revelation that you have, then the truer the choice that the character's essential nature. In other words, you're put under pressure and you're taking action, making choices and taking action. And those choices that you're making are the revealing of your character. So you're placed within that context, you're making choices, taking action, character is revealed, and the process is unfolding over time. So to abstract this out, these are kind of like the elements of storytelling, but they're also the elements of experience and the element of processes, because there's a context, a quality, a character, and a story. So I'm going to first look at the quality. So the quality, I look at some of the different existing communication media from video games and different human-computer interaction from web design and narrative design and mobile phones. And then there's different aspects of the emotional presence that you get from the film and lighting and music. And then you have the embodied and environmental presence that comes from kind of hijacking your sensory motor contingencies, but also different aspects of architecture and environmental presence and different aspects of theater and dance. So you have the active presence from the video games, and mental and social presence from the, cruising the web and talking to your friends on social media and on the phone. You have emotional presence, and then an embodied and environmental presence. Now, each of these are all happening all at the same time. And then it's some sort of like, there's a center of gravity of which ones that you're really focused in on. So it's about taking action and making choices, emotional immersion, and sensory experience. Now, you can look at a progression of communication media over time where maybe, let's say, just assume that the very first form was oral storytelling and then eventually theater. And then there was the printed books and then film, radio, TV, video games, internet, mobile phones, and VR and AR. So at each time there's a new communication media, it's both including the previous media, but also transcending the limitations of the previous, and there's new affordances. And I have roughly correlated to each new affordance, say like video games as an example, is all about active presence. And there's a lot of aspects of film and television, so very much about, building and releasing tension over time to cultivate an emotional presence. And then VR and AR is a lot about embodiment and different aspects of your environmental presence, but also including all the previous media. But the sense of presence is really the thing that's new and different. And Mel Slater has really been a pioneer of not only doing a lot of embodiment research, but also doing like the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society. The place illusion and plausibility is the two fundamental illusions that he says are a part of virtual reality. And to break these out, the place illusion is that you feel like that you're actually have this sense of being in another place, and that place is real, and that the plausibility illusion is that you believe that it's real, even though at some part that it's not real, but there's an illusion that kind of tricked your brain into thinking it's real, good enough to the point where it creates the illusion. Now, there's lots of different, theories of presence out there. I personally am a fan of Dustin Chertoff, who has a very similar theory to the kind of the elemental theory that I have. He was independently created this like before I did and before I had discovered it, but he was looking at advertising and how experiential design had originated from the marketing field, where it was used to encourage people to create meaningful and emotional social connections to a product. Going back to the Pine and Gilmore and the experiential age, kind of the frontiers of experiential marketing had broken out that there was sensory, cognitive, affective, active, and relational. As I break that out, there's the active, cognitive and relational, affective, and sensory. That's Chertoff's, and mine is active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, embodied and environmental presence. Now, there's lots of other aspects of presence theory. This by no means is a comprehensive theory. I think there's always going to be incomplete aspects. And so there's other surveys of different aspects and, going into more different details of it. But on the whole, I'd say themes that come up again and again. Even this is the summary from Skarbaz, where he talks about, social presence and place illusion, plausibility illusion, and co-presence, social dimensions and plausibility in place. And the thing that's not in here that I would say is the emotional aspect. All right, so that's the quality. But you can look at the qualities from fire, air, earth, and water, which of course goes back to ancient philosophy, Empedocles with earth, air, fire, and water. He says that his assumption is that the four eternally existing roots, the arrangement and rearrangement of which account for all the genesis and oleutheros, and for the particular and changing characteristics of the netta. So, it starts with Empedocles and then goes on and kind of transmitted through different aspects of ancient philosophy. There's different ways of kind of having these hot, cold, wet, and dry as you look at the different elements. So there's a sort of tetradic dialectic between these two poles between hot, cold, wet, and dry. And this, the origins, this is from an Empedocles extant fragments. It actually gets traced back to medical origins. Going back to there's the Philistine, but also the Hippocratic nature of man, and connecting to the phlegm, blood, yellow, and black bile. But in essence, that you could say that there's a combination of, say, hot and dry is fire, hot and wet is air, wet and cold is water, and wet and dry is earth. A way of kind of intuitively breaking that out is that on one way is like giving outward and receiving inward, and then the dry is sort of the individuating, and the wet is a little bit more bonding. Again, this is sort of rough just approximations of trying to give an intuition for how it translates into the active presence, mental social presence, emotional presence, and embodied presence. But there's also Chinese philosophy that has the concepts of the yang and the yin, which is very much connected to the fire and the air for the yang, and the earth and the water for the yin, where there's more of a receptive and active aspects, where one is more outward, one is more inward, one is more giving, one is more receiving, one is more talking, and one is more listening. And these are some of the different, correspondences for the yang and the yin. But I think the dialectic between these, you could also go into the left brain, right brain, many different ways in which the concepts of dialectic in general are a part of the qualitative process. So as we look at the different aspects of the quality, now I'm going to just go to a brief sidebar for some of these and just kind of a quick hit. So for me, I think a lot about pluralism. I take an approach from trying to blend together different aspects of Chinese philosophy, natural philosophy, ancient philosophy, philosophy of perception, different aspects of qualia. Then there's the incompleteness of language for experiences, how our languages that we have are always going to be not as robust as our direct experiences. And I'll talk about why that is. Peirce's triads, and then the dialectics and polarities. So the pluralism in the philosophy of math, I had a chance to talk to Michelle Friend at, she's a philosopher of math. I talked to her at the Joint Mathematics meeting in Baltimore, I think back in like 2016 or 2017. I got into sort of Platonic mathematic ideas and was talking to different philosophers of mathematics. But she was actually suggesting that pluralism as a foundation, meaning that that's kind of an oxymoron because it's unstable. But her definition is that the pluralists and foundations believe that there's insufficient evidence to think that there is a unique foundation for mathematics. Moreover, the pluralist and foundations works under the assumption that there is no reason to think that there will be a convergence to a unique theory in the future. He takes seriously the possibility, or he or she takes seriously the possibility that there are several together inconsistent foundations in mathematics. This is sort of getting into the Gödel's incompleteness, where any sort of framework you have is going to be incomplete, and really embracing that as kind of a pluralistic approach, saying that each foundational idea and framework is going to reveal to some aspect of realities, but it's also going to be including other aspects of reality. So it's important to have a pluralistic blending of lots of different approaches, which I think is partly a part of why I am sort of scattered across all these different approaches. But it's also the bandwidth of our senses is very small in terms of what we're able to actually take in. There's so much of our conscious awareness that goes beyond our sight, touch, hearing, and smell that our body is unconsciously processing, and it's sub-symbolic. We can't even put words to it. It's something that goes beyond even the language. And so Jungian theories have different aspects of the unconscious that speak to that. Bradley has different aspects of the actualization that goes into the monadic, dyadic, triadic, and tetradic. And this is sort of the sidebar, so I'm not going to dig into great detail. Suffice to say that something like the dialectic is more of a, both a, polarity, but also the synthesis of the polarity is the triadic aspect of that. Integration and difference from Grant Maxwell, he's discussing in a upcoming book I'm really looking forward to. He's a process relational thinker that's kind of blending together aspects of Spinoza, Leibniz, Hegel, Schelling, Nietzsche, James Bergson, Jung, Whitehead, Derrida, Deleuze, Hillman, and Stingers, all thinking about these sort of dialectical thinking and how that plays into, through the historical, philosophical history. Tim Eastman talks about the triads in philosophy, and James Bradley has got the semiotics with the interpretant, representant, and object. And then there's a new book that came out recently that I've been really digging into, which is called Collective Essays in Speculative Philosophy. And Bradley does this great survey of all these different philosophers and starting to break out the different triadic theories of actualization. And I think why this is important for me is that you have something that's undifferentiated aspects, and then you start to make some sort of a differentiation. And from that differentiation, then you start to have order. So I think the foundations of perception start to get into these underlying triadic theories of actualization. And again, this is some more references to sort of dig into that from the appendix. But back to the qualities, that's all the qualities. Now moving on to the story. So the story, you have the Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. You have Dan Harmon's story circle. You have the 3-act structure. And then you have this, the story is the unfolding of what's happening and changing over time. So there's something that's happening, and there's different frameworks to understanding the story. I like this from Alex McDowell because he's saying that back in the days before linear media, that there used to be a tribal nature of the oral storytelling tradition, which meant that the story was never fixed. It was always dynamic and participatory, where you tell a story and it would be a communal process, and it would change and adapt as the culture adapted. I mean, I guess we have that still today with the reinterpretation of like Dune was just reimagined, but there's the tendency to have like a canonical version of the media that started with the printing press. And I think we're moving back into this world that has more participation. And I'd say a key part of that participation is potential. And the potential is a key part philosophically of process philosophy, is trying to reintegrate different aspects of potential. So thinking about potential is going to allow you to understand the future of interactive storytelling, where you have Lebowitz and King has different, a spectrum of authored versus generative stories, where you have from one end, it's completely authored. On the other end, you have different aspects of more gamified dimensions of the storytelling. So on one end, you have no agency or impact on the story. On the other end, it's more of like a maximized agency and expression of your will. And then you have your kind of a passive experience with static particle-like actuals. And then the other end, you have the participatory experience with dynamic waves of potential. So kind of using the quantum ontology to say that one is sort of the substance static thing, and the other has these waves of potential and possibility. All right. And then you have the philosophical references for a story. So I'm going to be digging in a little bit more into the importance of potential, the block model versus participatory universe, time, and then the debate between Einstein and Bergson around duration. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about context now. So that was quality, then story, now context. So context is something that when you think about world building, you have to think about building and describing all different scales of reality that you're translating different aspects of culture into a world. Like just think of the Black Panther and all the different world that they had to create with Wakanda, and all the different aspects of what's the medical, what's the technology, what's the infrastructure for travel. And so thinking about all these different things, this is the mandala that Alex McDowell has. And I'd say the key part here is that this is really describing a system of context. There's lots of other contexts. These are the different domains of human experience that I've used to talk about different ethical and moral dilemmas within XR. This is the XR Ethics Manifesto, where I start to dig into great detail for all the different ethical and moral dilemmas about the technology. And just the context ends up being a very useful frame for being able to map out all these different dilemmas. Again, if you want more details, you can watch this presentation and other slides. Also, the dimensions of nested context. And nested context is an important aspect of mereology, which I'll get into here in a second. But Lessig says that there's different aspects of cultural norms, the law, the market, and technology, architecture, and the code. But he has these as kind of independent vectors that are all playing on the user. Whereas here, you can also look at it in terms of nested context, where, well, and I'll dig into that. I'll come back to that in a second. But also virtual reality, augmented reality is all about the context of the real environment. To what degree are you having the virtual augmentation or a complete virtual environment? Where you're context switching, where you're in the center of gravity of your existing context and you're adding context on top of it in AR. In VR, you're doing a complete context switch. And there's also different intersecting axes of privilege, domination, oppression. This is from intersectional feminist thought of looking at different ways in which that people have domination and power and privilege within society, and that plays out as a form of context in the way that it's kind of embedded into the language and a whole series of different assumptions. And so it's important to recognize the need for both diversity and inclusion, not only in the creation of content, but also in the making sure that the whole ecosystem is as inclusive and diverse as possible. To try to the only way to do this is to get everybody have a seat at the table. So some of the philosophical aspects here: mereology, which I'll talk about, measurement, input, output, context, privacy, ethics, and human rights, and then embodied cognition is a huge important concept. So mereology is the study of the wholes and parts. And so you have the atoms are a part of the molecules, which are a part of the organelles, and you can start to go from the smallest dimensions all the way up to the largest. And that's why sort of using these biological metaphors that you can start to use this concepts of wholes and parts to describe all of the nature of reality. And so mereology is sort of like the mathematical structure of process, because all processes are happening within the context of larger processes, but they're also often have sub-processes. It's basically processes all the way down. And then the Stanford Encyclopedia defines mereology as the theory of parthood relations, the relations of the part to the whole, and the relations of the part to the whole within a whole. So again, there's some references for the Handbook of Mereology, and Oxford has a new book on mereology that has more of the history of mereology. But this was something that Whitehead brought forth in some of his Process and Reality, and really started to popularize it more within the context of philosophy. Even though it's been talked about, you can look at this book from Oxford to get more of the history. But the context also has this book called Untying the Gordian Knot, that real world interactions always have a triad of cycles of input, output, and context. So for every measurement you have at a quantum level, it always has to take into consideration what the context of that measurement is. You can never have any objective measurement outside of the context. And so that's, in peer review, you always look at, how is this recorded? Is it, fit with the contextual expectations? And, the context ends up being, especially at the quantum level, absolutely critical. And so Eastman is saying you can actually never have real world interactions that are absent of context. Contextual integrity is a huge philosophy of privacy by Helen Nissenbaum, where she starts to define the privacy as the flow of information that is within a normative standard within a certain contextual domain. And so Lessig's pathetic dot theory and nested context, again, you can start to look at it. So at the broadest context is the earth, then you have the culture, then laws, economy, design guidelines, network architecture, XOR hardware, operating system and code, application code, and then the user experience. And so this ends up being a very useful framework for understanding at what point are you going to address different ethical issues. Is there a technological fix? Is there a cultural fix that has to happen from the culture? Is there something where you have to pass new laws? Or is it something that the market dynamics can sort out? And is it in right relationship with the earth? And then again, this is the different domains of human experience. That when I ask people the ultimate potential of VR, they usually answer into one of these domains, but it also helps to break out the different domains of the applications of XR and ethical issues as well. This was from Laval Virtual, where we did a brainstorm, mapped these out, and then over the course of 2019, did lots of different panel discussions to kind of map out a cartography of ethics of XR through the lens of context. But you can also look at human rights issues, but as well as sustainable development goals and the responsible innovation dimensions. These are all contextual domains that you can start to map out relative to each other and start to see how to translate human rights into the domain of VR, which is a big thing actually that once I get talking here, I'm going to be talking with the EFF, talking about different, human rights approaches to XR. And then the final aspects here is embodied cognition as a series of nested contexts. That's the idea that the brain is in the context of the body and that the body is in the context of the environment, and that both embodied cognition and distributed cognition are saying that no thought is absent of the embodied context as well as the context from the environment that you're around. So that the way that the very nature of how we think is relative to the contextual domains of our embodied experiences as well as the environment. And again, if you look at this sort of contextual nested hierarchy of all the different communication media, then there's a nested domain there. Then the final thing is just the character. These are just different aspects of the character that's being exhibited and throughout the course of the story. What's the character arc? If you think about a character arc, how is someone growing or changing? What's the quality or the personality characteristics of someone, or the feelings and needs when you talk about character motivations and why they do what they do. But this is all about the growth and change, and but also gets to the issue of the problem of universals, and are those character aspects, are they a property of it, or are they fundamental and they're being expressed as some sort of platonic realm of ideal forms? You also have the kairos and the quality of the moment and the archetypal cosmology. And I also point to Grant Cameron's Tracing of Emerging Worldview that does a deeper dive into different aspects of the archetypal cosmology and lots of kind of process relational approaches into each of the different chapters that he does. All right, so now I'm going to do kind of like a quick run through some of the different concepts and ideas of process philosophy, and then talk about process, perception and design, and then open it up for questions. So back in October 31st of 2020, there was a 2-hour process thought at a new threshold. It was put on by the Cobb Institute. John Cobb was a theologian that was, helped to take the work from Charles Hartshorne and apply process relational thinking to theology. And so a lot of the theologists within the last 20th century have really been carrying forth the work of process relational thinking, but there's so many different applications. And there was just a series of 10-minute conversations that were talking about like Christian theology, or interfaith, or education, or science, or economics, or agriculture, all the way up to like Chinese philosophy. So process philosophy has gone off and had so many different applications and had lots of different influence. And that sort of kicked me off, and I did an interview with a Whitehead scholar, Matt Siegel. This was a great primer, a 90-minute primer to get just the basic of all the different fundamental ideas and concepts of process philosophy. And he's also got a book here called Physics of the World Soul. And there's another book here, Quantum of Explanation, and then Untying the Gordian Knot. These are books that have just helped me I guess, get oriented, because some of the original source material of Process Reality by Alfred North Whitehead, as brilliant as he is, he's not always the best communicator of his ideas in the way that is clear and understandable. So I've had to rely upon a lot of secondary literature and other people who are scholars and really figured out all of his neologisms and how to sort of navigate the underlying concepts. And so I'm going to share some of those concepts. I've already mentioned how there's a relationality there at the core of it, and that there's the process and potential, and how there's a sort of a whole part mereological set of relations of event sequences as the basis of reality. And then he's in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for Whitehead. It says that there's a number of different quantum ontologies that are developed inspired by this process relational approach. These are the ones that I mentioned earlier. You can dig into some of those. The foundations of relational realism is the one that I've come across the most in terms of Untying the Gordian Knot, which is actually a book by Timothy Eastman. He used to be a NASA scientist and turned to philosophy in his retirement, and is basically doing this massive synthesis of all these process relational thinkers in a book that came out in 2020 called Untying the Gordian Knot. They've been doing weekly discussions about this book and breaking down and bringing in these cutting edge quantum philosophers like Ruth Kastner and Michael Epperson, and having these really rich and deep discussions about his book that's been happening for the last 7 months now. So I've been really enjoying that sequence, and some of this information is coming from those discussions. So a big difference of the existing metaphysical cosmology is that Whitehead kind of disagreed with the ways in which that Einstein was spatializing time in a way of creating in a fourth dimension, which implied that all of space-time had already already happened, that, the past, present, and future was already, the universe was already whole, that it was already complete. There was no aspect of novelty, creativity, or participation where whatever we did didn't matter because we're just these deterministic bots that are kind of unfolding in a way that has already happened. And the alternative is that each moment to moment is a moment that is being created, that actually space-time is created out of the quantum potential, and that all of the universe is being constructed moment to moment. And that potential is sort of an unfolding process. And in that, you have novelty, creativity, and participation, where you as an individual have the potential to be in relationship, in participation with the universe as it unfolds. So, getting down the quantum, the foundations of relational realism, it's going against this classical block world and saying that space is actually emergent from a dynamical topological quantum event structures, and that there's these spatial temporal extensiveness and its metrical structure is emergent from a dynamical topological quantum event structure. So in other words, all of the realities at the basis, the quantum reality, and then from that we have space-time that emerges out of that. So there's like a non-local field that then collapses or somehow is constructed into the space-time that we have, which is the naturalistic world that we live in. And then you have the physical things that are the outcome of the real histories of these quantum events. And so you can think about all these physical things are understood as the outcome of real histories of quantum events, and that you have to reconceptualize your ontological and contextual properties as mutually implicative features of every quantum event. So the quantum event basically unfolds, and then all of the different processes are being seeded from those events. And again, back to the substance metaphysics and process relational metaphysics, which we've talked about a number of different times. But Kastner, Kaufman, and Epperson have this paper of why quantum potential should be considered as having ontological reality. There's a tendency to want to dismiss the potential and to kind of spatialize it out, like the Everett's interpretation, or even the spatialization of all space-time into one 4D object. It's the elimination of that potential. And these quantum philosophers are arguing that you should not be collapsing that potential. And I think that's a common theme from both Whitehead and all the process philosophers that I've also seen, is this relationship of potential and the importance of potential, and that the possible events are real, they're not actual, they exist, but they're not in space-time. So this is a visualization from Kastner that goes into how there's a series of different quantum interactions, and they're kind of doing a handshake. And when they do the handshake, then that's when they actualize. And that's, kind of metaphorically the collapsing of the wave function. But there's an actualized reality and the quantum potential that's happening between those two. And again, in the book of Untying the Gordian Knot, there's an application of Boolean logic. And so the mathematical structure between the two is that there's a combination of a family of Boolean logics, where there's a logic of actualizations, which is standard Boolean logic, and then a non-Boolean logic for potentia. And somehow those non-Boolean logics are being projected onto the sort of the Boolean logic that we experience, but that there is kind of like this non-spatial temporal non-Boolean logic that exists. So again, the actualized reality is the Boolean logic, and the quantum potential is the non-Boolean logic. And that there's particle-like actuals and then waves of potential. And then you can go back to the storytelling metaphors, where there's different degrees of potential that are embedded into the aspect of storytelling, which is a big part of interactive storytelling. And also been in the past of tribal storytelling, and in the future of this more collaborative participatory media that we have in the future. And again, getting down to the time and the nature of time, Hans Primus actually was arguing that you can't understand time unless you are taking this kind of non-Boolean approach. So he has this whole thing where he's saying a full understanding of time is not possible within a Boolean logic. And because of that, you have to sort of look at this sort of correlated of material, mental, and temporal domains. He's using the mathematical metaphor of Bohr-Riemann rings, which means that they're all kind of embedded together in this kind of potential. But it gets back to the kairos, and so how there's different aspects of potential that are embedded that's separate and distinct from the Cronus. Now, the Whitehead had an idea of eternal objects, and those objects are kind of have the Platonic realm, and you have somehow the Platonic realm are interfacing with the physical reality. And that's where you have the eternal objects that are those quantum potential. So there could be different aspects of the eternal objects in the Platonic realm that's in the quantum potential, and that would be sort of Aristotle's formal causation. So ways that there's the mathematical structure and the blueprint of reality that's interfacing with reality. when we think about the four different causes from Aristotle, the formal cause, the material cause, efficient cause, and final cause, we have a lot of focus of analytic philosophy and material and efficient cause, not a lot of focus of formal cause and final cause. And I think that's one of the other things that process philosophy starts to bring back are different aspects of final causation and teleology, as well as this formal causation. And the mechanism of that formal causation are through these eternal objects that are translating the pure potentials and from the quantum potential, and then eventually somehow manifesting into the physical world. All right, and that's through the process of concrescence, which I talked about. And so concrescence is our experience is kind of a stream of elementary processes that are kind of growing together, the feelings into one. So again, this as a metaphor of thinking about how there's all these different dimensions of concrescence that are all coming together. And it's the stream of elementary processes of the many feelings into one. So just as a metaphor to think about the processes that are unfolding. All right, I'm going to just quickly go through the perceptionist process and designist process. I've talked about these before. You can look at previous things, but just the idea that if process is the fundamental aspect of reality, then you can use process as a metaphor to describe all sorts of things, including perception and design. So there's lots of different models of perception and design. Lots of them have this sort of dialectic between the sensory experience and the mental models of reality. So you're going back and forth between your actual experience and then your models of that experience. How we learn, there's different attention, active engagement, error feedback, and consolidation. This is sort of one perceptual loop. Embodied cognition is another feedback loop between the brain, body, and the environment. The Ludo narrative meaning making, where there's the meaning that's coming from the designer, the actual system and the experience, and then the interactor. And so you have this kind of Peircean semiotic triadic relationship between the designer and the interactor. You have the different aspects of another process loop of perception, cognition, and action. So for each of the perception, we're understanding that we're taking action, and that XR is intervening at each of these different phases in different ways. You have the unconscious analysis and fusion of all the different input into different percepts at different scales. And so different taps. So all of our senses are coming in and they're being integrated at different scales relative to each other. And then the predictive coding theory of neuroscience, which is essentially that our brain is a prediction machine. It's have all these mental models of reality, and then you're listening to reality and you're making different predictions around that. But each of these different approaches of perception all have a process relational approach, which is this loop between sensory experience and mental models of reality, as well as the embodied cognition. And then finally, the designist process. You can think about the author design versus generative design, where you have like a waterfall process and an agile process. Anybody that does any like game design or design within the context of computer is moved well beyond the waterfall processes, but we still have different aspects of waterfall processes that are still legitimate in terms of constructing narrative or architectural design. And so it's the fusion of these different types of design practices, of the linear approach, of the more architectural approach, of the the film approach, which is more about pre-production, production, and post-production. This is Alex McDowell's way, but he sort of spatializes that as a linear process. But more and more, game design is an iterative process where you're constantly iterating, playtesting, and getting feedback. And then the methodologies of Scrum and design thinking, all of these have a process relational approach, which is all about iteration and trying to really understand your target audience, and then do this iteration between defining, ideating, prototyping, and testing, and really empathizing with who your target audience is, what they say, what they're doing, essentially what do they need to do, what do they do, what do they think, what do they say, what do they see, what do they hear, and what do they feel. So this is really tapping into the sort of underlying emotional reality, which is what the basis of the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics frameworks from Haneke et al. Is focusing on the aesthetics and the emotions as a baseline. You start with what you want to have the person feel, and then you design the mechanics and the dynamics around that goal of what you're having them feel. And Mish is talking all about the definition of a medium is addition and distribution. And you can start to look at, the progression of these different communication medium, but at the heart, there's new technologies that have new affordances. The creators are creating and exploring the new affordances. And then from there, it's distributed and given to the audience. And then eventually the audience gives feedback. And so just the development of these new communication media and the affordances is this feedback loop cycle between the tech gets affordances, what the artists are able to figure out how to utilize those affordances, getting it into the hands of people, and the audience has to learn how to watch them, and then they give this feedback loop. So just even the production of the communication process itself is a process. So that's the sort of the tour of what is experience, the philosophical context for process, experiential design framework, quality, story, context, and character, a little bit of a process philosophy primer, and then perception as process and design as process. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Let's thank our speaker. Have I been unmuted?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, good. So I'll start by opening it up. Are there any questions from the audience? If you do, please raise your hand. Dan, you're up first. Let me make sure. Go ahead.
Hey, Kent. I wanted to say that I really appreciate your crossover work in terms of experience as narrative, perception, mimetic, and including time in there as this kind of new space of inventive chronotope, I suppose. And I love that you threw semiotics in there. I've been looking a lot at Catherine Hales, who recently developed kind of a semiotic model of the virtual, which I found kind of interesting, and I've been wondering how it's going to hold up. But one thing I'm concerned with in terms of affordances is the embodied to extended cognition through things, specifically, through time, as you were saying, through experience, through presence, in kind of a rhetorical way when we talk about affordances. So when materials become kind of immaterial, but are still negotiated like actual material in a virtual environment or an extended environment, kind of like what Clark and Chalmers and Malfloris are working with about the term of like extended materiality. So when we're engaging with these kind of environments, and VR can really and greatly enhance these levels of material engagement and extended cognition. What do you think engaging senses and presence and artifacts all in tandem in these new ways with these new potentialities will do to kind of refashion ontologies of our engagement with materiality?
Yeah, and I would say the materiality is sort of, again, it's an assumption of substance metaphysics, which process relational metaphysics is trying to challenge in some fashion. So I think part of that is to have less focus of materiality and more focus on the experience of it, meaning that it as long as it's mediated through the technology, then we're going to have all sorts of different really exotic levels of embodiment that have the sensory addition, sensory substitution. We're going to be expanding our senses into things that up to this point have not been possible. So there's going to be expansion of the palette of different types of qualitative experiences that we can even have. And I think I think over time, there's going to be less of a differentiating factor for people who have spent enough time in VR. I've certainly had that myself where, going back to that Chalmers virtual irrealism, where you're saying, well, is this experience as valuable as something that happened in real life? And, certainly there's been a number of different experiences that would be impossible for me to have, but they're just as salient, just as meaningful to me as stuff that happened IRL. And quote unquote, I haven't figured out a good contrast because all of the words are about real and fake and virtual. Yeah. But I
call it practical reality on one side.
But they're all this is where I think the real shift away from substance metaphysics into more process relational metaphysics, we'll have to really find better words because it is less of a differentiation. There's an implied hierarchy, meaning that the embodied in real life thing is always going to be better, which I think it is likely that you would need to have a repository of embodied experiences for you to even have a really robust experiences within VR. If someone grew up only in VR, they wouldn't, they would be impoverished relative to someone who had a wide range of embodied experiences. So I always do think that there's a baseline of those embodied experiences. However, you're able to potentially expand out into things and do things that are impossible to do within the constraints of physical reality. And so there's going to be things that are going to be able to expand. Or a lot of people say AR is going to be better, more use cases or whatnot than VR. And then I'm like, well, but you're not constrained by any of the limitations of reality when you talk about some of these different virtual experiences. And so you're able to, it's a difference between a context, adding context and a slight modulation of your context to a complete context shift. And I think there's going to be things that we're doing, these different types of context shifts that go above and beyond anything else that we've experienced before. So that's some of my initial thoughts. I think, there's certainly a lot of, sensory substitution, sensory addition. There's a lot of, frontiers that for each of these have great potentials and great harms, which is why there's been a big part of my work in ethics of trying to at least map these things out and see at what level do you need to have the state intervene and say, actually, we shouldn't do this because, it's just going to be too problematic. Neuro rights is a big thing that comes up in ethics, talking about the right to identity, right to agency, right to mental privacy. These are all things that are going to have these immersive technologies that are going to be encouraging onto these fundamental rights that we have, and figuring out how to preserve those rights is a big part as we move forward. And there's likely going to need to have some legal intervention to be able to really create the most exalted potential of these technologies. Otherwise, we create this surveillance, dystopic, Big Brother, kind of reality. So yeah, that's at least how I'm starting to think about some of that.
So we are actually at full time. It is 3:30. So I wanted to give people who have grading and semester obligations the opportunity to leave. If you do go, please remember to fill out our Qualtrics survey. I'm going to be hanging on here just a little bit longer, continuing to take questions and have conversations. So no need to leave, but given that this is our allotted time, I wanted to have an opportunity where we could all thank Kent simultaneously before we keep talking. So Kent, thanks once more. And we hope those who leave have a good one. Are there other questions? If that's all right with you, Kent, to go just a little bit longer.
Yeah, happy to take some more questions.
Yeah. I know that I have a couple I'm hoping to ask. So thank you very much, Ashley, as well for your contributions to the panel. Is great. So Kent, if you don't mind, I want to ask a question. One of the things that you highlighted in sort of Whitehead's development of process philosophy was this concern about the way Einstein was setting up time as a fourth dimension, making for a sort of block universe that was deterministic. And I wondered if we're thinking about VR as a closed causal system designed by engineers like some of the folks that have been talking today, you might think that although the universe writ large is process oriented, this small subpart is going to follow, input output logic of computational systems and is going to be deterministic. And so part of me wonders, does this mean that this makes the fit difficult for thinking about what's going on in VR systems in process terms rather than something else?
I wouldn't say that it's deterministic in the sense that there's still potential. There's still ways that are unbounded where you can give opportunities for users to make choices. And thinking about in terms of, let's say, the narrative structure of Facade that has a drama manager that's listening to every little thing that you do, and then based upon that context is going to give you the best story of that run that you have. But there's 2,500 story bits that are in the waiting that would be ready to be delivered to you had you taken different choices. So there's still an ability to embed potential within these experiences and to have real emergence that happens from people making choices, especially when you have other people that are there. And so even though, and I would question as to whether or not, things are always incomplete. Things are never finished and there's always bugs, but there's also, it's always growing, it's always changing. And so I think I get dissatisfied by really trying to think about, the metaphysics of general relativity as an example, and try to see what kind of insights that gives me in terms of designing processes. I get more insight into process relational way of thinking of things because it's more iterative, it's more adaptive, it's more dynamic, it's inviting if everything's deterministic, then there's no intentional action or free will that is allowing the expression of creativity and novelty. Novelty was a big thing that was driving Whitehead's cosmology. In fact, that's sort of like the ultimate potential is creativity. And that, in fact, God is a subservient in Whitehead's framework to that creativity. So that creativity is actually higher than God. God is just in service of creativity and novelty. And when you think about the way that our brain is wired, when our brains are prediction machines, and so when we perceive, we're trying to determine difference. we're trying to find something that we haven't seen before. And we have seen that, then we get hit with dopamine because our brain wants to continually be updated with having more ability to be able to predict those things. And so novelty actually ends up being a big driver for what motivates us as humans. And so I think it's fitting to kind of see these aspects of novelty and creativity and potential. And so I would disagree with the assessment that just because the context has a deterministic aspect doesn't mean that humans are deterministic. We still have our ability to express our agency and the ability for us to, but also that the universe is in the process of unfolding, and that computer is going to die at some point. It's going to break. It's going to break down. It's not going to last forever. So even embedded within the context of the machine is a process of unfolding, meaning that eventually it's going to decay and die. Or that the experiences that you're going through are no longer going to work because Unity updated and there's not backwards compatibility. So the whole thing that you created is going to no longer be available. So I think thinking about process relational thinking about how this is at some stage of unfolding, and that it's going to be put out into the world and people are going to experience it, but at some point it's going to be dead. It's no longer going to be relevant, or it's not going to be working unless we figure out how to, have things managed to last forever. But I think there's still, in my mind, less of that deterministic and more of the aspects of potential that are still really vital. Metaphysics is an assumption, so you can assume whatever you want. You don't have to, it's basically like a guesswork. There's no way to prove it one way or another. I just find that there's more fruitfulness out of the process relational metaphysics than the existing substance metaphysics when I think about experience.
So I'll just tag on at the end that I might be one of those weirdos who doesn't see deterministic forces as threats to free will properly construed. So if I put myself in the compatibilist camp, that might change my interpretations of some of these things, but we should also check to see if other people have questions. Is there anybody else here who would like to ask a question? Do either of my panelists have questions that they'd like to ask?
We're engineers. We don't not understand the conversation at this point.
So I might indulge then and ask another follow-up question. I was interested and jealous that you've had a chance to look at Chalmers' book, and that might be interpreting some of your, or coloring some of your interpretations of his work. But to have the question of value lumped in along with these metaphysical questions was a little bit surprising to me, at least at a first pass.
Oh, so the Chalmers references that I have are stuff that's publicly available. I haven't included anything in here. So what were the things of value that you were referring to?
Oh, just that, there's sort of these things that cluster together. There's sort of like, is virtual reality real or an illusion? Is it valuable or less valuable? That sort of thing. And so I wondered, though, how much of the push to say that experiences in virtual reality are valuable depend on the assumption that at some point you'll pull out and continue to engage in meat space. That's what I've been calling IRL. That if all of the rest of it stays in virtual reality, if we might think that the experiences are less valuable at that point, how much that assumption that you'll pull out at some point is driving the intuition that it's valuable.
Yeah, I have to really, he wrote an essay called Virtual and the Real. He was a series of lectures he gave in 2016. And then his book digs into it quite a bit as well. And I'm going to be interviewing him in January. So I'm going to be reading it in preparation for that. And so there's a lot of stuff that I'm tacking onto that from my own perspective. I would say is, probably from my point of view than his, in terms of saying that, if you have a physicalist materialist worldview, that's me adding on top, but that's not Chalmers, although Chalmers has argued for panpsychism at his TED Talk, just taking radical approaches because of the hard problem of consciousness. So the valuable aspect for me, my intuition is that I've had enough direct embodied experiences of things in VR that have been meaningful to me, where it just seems like intuitive that would be a ridiculous philosophical argument to argue against my own experience. To be like, no, but I've experienced it. So because I've experienced it and I know it, then why would you assume that it would be otherwise. And I think for me, that's where I get down to the substance metaphysics as a sort of metaphysical assumption. Chalmers, as far as I could tell, and as far as I was searching through his book, never mentions anything about process philosophy. It was a great disappointment that he wasn't on that bandwagon and not sort of picking up on as to what to me feels like the next logical argument. After that it's valuable, then well, let's sort of question why and really look at the underlying metaphysical relationships. And then I guess my disappointment, but then was like a little bit of optimism. I was like, well, I guess there's still things that I have to say that he doesn't say. That he does a great job of doing this whole survey from the analytic tradition, and I wasn't brought up in the analytic tradition, so I'm kind of like coming outside of the analytic tradition, trying to like find how to pull in all these other, like a more pluralistic approach of kind of like pull in a little bit of Chinese philosophy and a little bit of ancient philosophies, and just see how they kind of mix these together in a way that makes sense for me as my own sense making frameworks for all these things. So I'm going to be talking to Chalmers. I'm very curious to do a closer reading to see that, but I think it was his initial provocations that he came up with in 2016 and his lectures that he first gave, where he first started to talk about that. And I remember seeing videos of that. I couldn't find maybe the exact lectures, but I remember watching those lectures and then getting some slides back in 2016, 2017, or probably 2017, 2018 after he gave it in 2016. So yeah.
It's an extension of some work that he was doing in the early 2000s in response to the Matrix coming out, right? Where he's like, people are interpreting the Matrix as this like mind-blowing epistemological turn. He's like, I think it's actually like interesting to look at the metaphysical turn as well, and like how we're going to interact with these things. So I'm looking forward to exploring that more as well. But I was just thinking about like Robert Nozick's experience machine, right? It's this thought experiment that I'm hoping we can talk about at some point, colleagues. But basically a virtual machine that will allow you to have all the pleasurable experiences you could ever want. Right. And his intuition is that if you were given the opportunity to step into it for the rest of your life, most people would say no. And the reason that they would say no is because we care more just about experiences of pleasure and happiness, but we also care that it's real. And he ties that in some sense to mattering. And so he thinks no one would want to step into this, even if the experiences were real and pleasurable, because we care about more than just those things. And so then that got me thinking about when we're talking about VR, does it being valuable depend on us being able to pull back out of it?
So I'll just ask, what if we all step into it? Wouldn't it become a reality altogether? If I'm there, you're there, we all have those great experiences. Would it be, then it matters,
Right, if the impacts on the other people
are real. And that becomes a reality from now on. I mean, we're all there. Does it change anything?
But then this would be Chalmers' point, is that then the difference is just metaphysical, whether the bottom out of the stuff is particles or electrons of stimulated experiences. It's just a difference of metaphysics. And so that's not the way to cash out what makes them real, et cetera. I'm seeing, sorry, Nicole has their hand up. So I'm gonna invite to unmute and participate as well.
Thank you. So hi, Kent, thank you. I really appreciated your talk. I did my PhD with Roland Faber in 2014. So it was refreshing to see your talk, and I appreciate the things that you added to the conversation. And honestly, I was going to hop in there for a second, but you answered my question as you continued to talk, so I couldn't figure out how to get my hand down.
Oh. What was your question?
So the reason why we wouldn't stay in the experience machine is because there really is a paucity of relationality in a thing like that. It might be a real experience, but it's not enough. It doesn't add enough data to the set, right? There's a paucity of relationality there that would make it so that people wouldn't choose, right? And you got onto that eventually.
Yeah.
And the question of whether it's a substance metaphysic or relational metaphysic almost becomes moot at that point, although I guess my answer depends on a relational metaphysic.
Yeah.
But you got there. So
yeah, and I think, as we're talking about these experience machines and everything, I don't I don't think that it's necessarily going to always have to tie back to like a quote unquote IRL or material reality, or, you know, whatever reality you want to call the opposite of the simulated reality. Because I do think that there's going to be, and I've already had experiences that are just as meaningful in absence of having any other people involved or any other thing other than the experience that I'm having. You know, you can have a way of neural pathways into the brain, and it's modulating different experiences and building, releasing tension. So there's been plenty of experiences I've had in the virtual realm that have been extremely meaningful without any, let's say, I mean, there are always signs and signifiers and semiotics. I mean, there's always going to be ways in which that things are being communicated, and, you know, the intentionality of the artist and to what degree is that being transmitted. So there's always going to be that element of that sort of final causation for what the artist is trying to bring about and to try to communicate. But aside from that, there's, I don't know, I wouldn't want to try to tie any sort of conditionality that things being meaningful because it's connected to something that happens later. It can be just as meaningful as happening as a very ephemeral, and it just happens and it's beautiful, or it's meaningful, or it strikes you in a certain way, or gives you an insight, or connects you to another person, or you have a conversation. You know, the qualities of presence, the mental and social presence, so it gives you an idea, or you have a conversation. The embodied presence, so you feel really grounded in your body, or you feel like you're really in a place and the environment's beautiful. Or emotional presence, it's invoking different aspects of your emotions. Or active presence, you're able to express your agency in a way that's very satisfying, meaning that you are able to really feel like you're a part of something that's unfolding, and you can see traces of your agency, and you're able to co-create something that would have never been possible without your agency being expressed in just the way that you did it. So each of those different qualities of presence are, you know, immediate phenomenological experiences that are valuable.
Yeah. Well, we should probably call it there because the lab needs to be handed over to the next group that's coming in here. But I really appreciate all y'all's time. Ken, thanks so much again. And hopefully we'll be able to continue these sorts of conversations in the future. So
yeah, it sounds good. I'll be in touch. A local recording, I'll probably post it on my my YouTube channel here at some point. But yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's great to be able to do a deep dive into some of this really wonky philosophical stuff.
Awesome. We really appreciate it too. Thanks so much.
Thanks, man.
Everybody else here, please click on the Qualtrics survey if you can, so we can improve this in the future, and have a good day.